I did find that a very interesting talk. Um, um, and so what I found interesting about that is that I often do speak on the side kind of like this emptiness, you see, because when we look at ourselves and we look inside and we find that there's no I, there's nothing to hang our hat on that we could say I, and we kind of hit this emptiness though. And so, sometimes people do get a little depressed and say, well, you know, there's nobody to have fun here, and who who can do it? And but actually, there's another side of that. I think it's the side that we should all make ourselves familiar with, and that side is that we're all connected. That's the beautiful thing of it. When you get rid of this I, my, and me, and you look and see what's there, what you see is you see us. We're all connected. So just look at the climate. There it goes right there. How we're all connected with the climate, and it goes with everything. The U.S. is over there starting all kinds of problems in these other countries, and the way that they're doing it. Now look what they're doing here in the country. That same style that they're treating the people in those countries, they're now treating people here in this country. So we are definitely all connected, and so we should kind of look at that when we practice, because that's something that we can actually see when we practice, and that's why we do practice and keep this not knowing mind. And can people hear me? You can hear me? Okay. So, we want to be able to keep this not knowing mind and look at it. So yeah, I could say that we're all connected, yada 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 yada. But you actually got to feel that yourself when you practice. You need to really feel that yourself when you practice. But I can tell you a bit of my experience when I saw when my father passed away. Okay, and so that I found was kind of interesting in that. When he passed away, I I watched him. I was right there, and at one point he reached out, and then and he was looking off in a distance. And for me, the thing that I really saw right there in that experience was that he was actually just moving on. So his body was there, all right, but he just moved on. And what was very interesting, I thought about it, was that he was just passing through some and going through some other phase. So that was his body there. That wasn't the end of him. And I really felt that really closely. But what was also interesting about that point was that uh, this his passing and his going through whatever it is that he was going through, because I can't say what he was going through. He's going on to some other phase, some travel, some path, whatever. But I can tell you what it wasn't. It wasn't Christian. It wasn't Buddhist. It wasn't Muslim. It wasn't any of those things. It's very interesting to see that. It was something that was happening, and it wasn't any of those things. It wasn't any of these kind of religions or philosophies or doctrines. He was just, doing that. But, so we don't want to like laugh at ourselves so much. Sometimes we can a little bit, because we can be a little silly at times. But you have to understand that human beings are really caught up in this idea of death, and we have to have some way of coping with it throughout the ages. So we have these religions and we have these philosophies and we have these ideas. But it was really, for me, very interesting to see that point of somebody just passing and going on, and it not having to do with any of these things that we're talking about that makes us feel good. So and that's a kind of way about when we do the funeral ceremony. So it reminds me of the funeral ceremony in the sense that when you have the funeral ceremony, whether it's in the Western style or the Buddhist style where they have the 49 days or something like that, that Buddhist ceremony is just as much for the people that are who have lost that person as it is for the person who passed away. So that's a kind of important point. And yeah, so that's kind of things that made me think of when you were speaking, Todd. Yeah. And so it is important to see, yes, everything is empty, and also that this emptiness is not really empty because everything comes from that emptiness. So that's also kind of like the way the Westerners think is that this emptiness is infinite possibilities. And I believe that's from a Japanese Zen master who said that. And but you got to really not get caught into this kind of nihilistic thinking, but understand that we're all connected and that we all helping here to help each other, whether we know it or not. We all what we do affects each other, and if it doesn't work out, well, we're all going to come back. It's going to happen again. So we all saw Groundhog Day, right? Just imagine the whole world going through that. The combinations that we got to do. Anyways, that's just my idea. Don't let's not get attached to that. Anyways, does somebody have some question? Okay, then.
Yes, Kwan Haeng Sunim. Charlie speaking here. What you just mentioned about the funeral ceremonies often being held for just, for the people as well as for the person who's passed away is
Mm,
something I often feel about when we're chanting for others, doing Kwan Seum Bosal chanting or Kwan Jijang Bosal chanting, is that we are chanting to free our own minds as well as for the passing or the troubles of other people. Uh,
mm.
do you have comments about that?
Uh, it, yeah, I think that you know that all of like you're born into a certain family, and you're born into a certain country and even a state, and so in that sense, all of our consciousnesses are connected. So when you have somebody who passes away, this chanting, the quantum Bosai chanting, I feel has that effect as yeah, we're very strongly looking at ourselves as an individual, but in actuality, this it's not an individual state. So this quantum bosa especially helps, and it helps when we do like with the family member, because that's family member and yourselves and ourselves are all our consciousnesses are actually quite close. So that you're not so much with somebody over in another country or another family, but family members, their consciousnesses are actually quite close. So yeah, it's a kind of important thing to chant for your family members when they're having some trouble or something like that. And in addition, with the Jijong Bosa chanting, is that it is for yourself, and for the one that person that passed away, but it's also an additional kind of a thing because for us, there is the person who passed away. If And this is just kind of like coming from where where my kind of understanding is that that person who passed away, if you're really sad, okay, so when you do the ceremony, the 49-day ceremony, do the last ceremony, they call it 49-day ceremony, then you are agreeing with your family members that that's the end of the mourning period. And the reason why you have to have the end of the mourning period is so that your loved one can move on. If your loved one is still around while you're in miserable and moaning and groaning, it doesn't free them. Okay, so you not only are you freeing yourself of the mourning and the sadness, you're also letting them go so that they can move on to their next whatever it is, and do so without the the sadness. And I sometimes understand that sometimes people can be so sad it makes it difficult for that spirit to move on. So that's kind of like how I see it, and it is actually the whole ceremony is quite important. Okay,
Thank you.
Charlie. Yeah, you're
Thank you.
welcome. So then I find that Zen Master Bon Hey, she's really thorough with all her teachings and stuff like that. So I don't have a lot of teaching to give you that she hasn't done already. Probably I have no teaching to give you that she hasn't done. So maybe I'll tell you a story. And there was in some years ago this Chinese monk, and he came from Shanghai, China, and he was born in 1907, and he died in 1986 in California. So he was in somebody who was born in China, and during after World War II, he had this big uh, orchard where he had a lot of fruit trees and stuff like that. But then China became nationalized, and so they, of course, he lost his orchard. And so then from there, he moved on to Hong Kong. And while he was in Hong Kong, he just became an accountant, and he was an accountant there in Hong Kong. He did that for a while. And then later on, he ordained. He ordained at the age of 41, and his name was Ta Tsung. And and then from there, he immigrated to the United States. In the United States, he came into New York, and of course, he was ordained. He spent some years practicing, and so he arrived in the United States in 1960. So he spent a lot of time practicing before he came over. And so he was at some of the temples in New York, and then some of the temples in Hawaii. But then he wound up into a place in Tennessee called Montego, a small town called Montego in Tennessee. And there he moved into a small house there. And at that time in the 60s, around 65, this was after he'd gone to the other few temples, and he wound up in Montego at around 1965 and moved into a small townhouse there. And it was around a university, and the university was a few miles away. It's got a interesting name. It's called the University of Sewanee, and it's in a, they call it the old South, the old Southern University is kind of what its nickname is. And so, anyways, he moved into that townhouse there, and sooner or later the students began to get to know him. And out front of his house there was this orchard, this big orchard, oak, not orchard, this big oak tree, and this oak tree had a wide girth. And so the neighbors came to him and told him that oak tree was dead, and if he didn't cut it down, it was going to wind up in his living room. So Ta Tsung, being the kind of person that he was, he went down to the local Army and Navy store, and where he got all his clothes, and he bought a hatchet, and he came in and he started to cut down the tree. And so it was interesting because he'd get up in the morning, and it was his routine. He'd get up in the morning and turn on the 60-watt bulb that he had in his room there. And then he'd fold his legs and meditate for a while. And then he'd get up and have his breakfast. And then he'd go out and start chopping the tree. And he was very consistent with this. And so it took him weeks and weeks to do it. But at some point, the town kind of saw what he was doing, and so what did they do? They all showed up with their chainsaws all sharpened and oiled, gasolined, and ready to go, and started, offered to cut down the tree. But he said no, he didn't want that. He kind of wanted to just cut it down himself. And so it was interesting because they didn't take offense at it. They just chuckled at him and said, he's just kind of like this funny guy. He wants to make things harder for himself. Okay, he can do that. And so then but they kind of had a respect for him because each morning he'd go in, he'd get up and he'd do his routine, and he'd go out there and he'd be hacking at the tree. And so sometime he was busy on that day, and if he was busy on that day, they missed him. Where was he out there? He wasn't out there chopping the tree. But after a good few weeks of doing that, it took him quite a while. One of the students was there when he finally got the tree so that it was about ready to chop down. And so the whole thing just came and fell and boom, and basically kind of shook his house in the whole town. That's how big this tree was. So then the student said, "So what's next?" And he said, "Firewood." And so that's what he did. He started to chop it up and make firewood. And a few months later, a tree this big took him with that hatchet a couple months. He had all this wood stacked up by his house. And so and I was just around that time. Some people I guess some of the students, one of the students understood that he was a Buddhist, that this was a Buddhist monk. And so the town, they really kind of liked this guy. He's very quiet and very regular, very routine. And so then when they heard that he was a Buddhist, they just out of respect started calling him Reverend Ta Tsung, which was kind of interesting. And during that time there was this other person who was a kind of a practicing person, and his name was Adonai, and he was into yogi and stuff like that. But he kind of claimed that he had that magic. He could do magical things, and so magical things happened when he was around. And this is around these college students, and they all got to thinking, this really caught their mind. And so one day Adano, he invited the students to his house to have a vegetarian meal, and then he was going to do a nice some ceremony with them. And so they were quite impressed with this, and so they went to have this meal, and they invited the Ta Tsung. They invited Ta Tsung to come there, and one of them had a bus that he used during his job, and so he picked everybody up, the wives and the girlfriends and the boyfriends and husbands and all of that, and they all went over to Donald's house to have the vegetarian meal. And so they sat down, and while they're eating, every once in a while, they'd look over at Ta Tsung and ask him how things are going. He would just nod his head. And then, if anybody asked him about Adano himself, he would quickly put something into his mouth and bite it. And then, so that kind of went on. And then at the end of the meal, it wasn't very eventful, but at the end of the meal, what he did is he had everybody take an apple and wrap it in tin foil. And so then before they did that, they had the apple and they did a meditation. And so then the meditation was supposed to put that karma into the apple. And then later, what you would do is you take the apple and wrap it in tin foil and leave it for like a week or two on their shelves. And then when they would open it up, and depending upon the look, it would say something about their karma, whether they were, their karma was there, whatever. And then, yeah, and everybody thought that was a pretty good ceremony, and they all, then after the ceremony, they got on a bus and was going home. And they were all in this kind of like really kind of inspired silence. This was an inspiring ceremony for them. So they get on the bus and they're very quiet, and the bus is going back to town. And then after a few minutes, or after a little while, all of a sudden they hear this crunch. And what had happened is that Ta Tsung bit into his apple. and they looked around and he had this idiotic look on his face. And everybody just kind of looked at him. And then as they were going around, one of the other students opened his up and he bit his apple. And then that was kind of like the end of that, the end of that situation. So, this one thing that was about Ta Tsung is that he never claimed any kind of special powers or anything like that. And this is kind of like what they liked about him. And he never really performed any, ceremonies or anything like that. But they began to say, what kind of person was this guy? How can you explain this person? And so there was one time when one of the students, and they guess they became kind of his student also. They went out into the town and they found him out front the Methodist church, and he was painting. And so then they looked to see what it was that he was painting, and he was painting the usual kind of like Chinese landscape thing where you have the big mountains and the water flowing and all of that. And partway down, there was this opening, kind of like the space in the painting, of course, in the space painting. And then there was somebody who was sweeping, and this person that was sweeping kind of had this glow around his head. And the author of this story says to him, what's happening? What's going on here? And so Ta Tsung said that this person was sweeping and he got enlightenment. And so then the student said, "What next?" And then Ta Tsung said, "Keep sweeping." So that was the kind of that kind of shows you a little about Ta Tsung. But it got me thinking a little bit about how people practice and practicing people of all kinds, Buddhists, monks, and nuns, and lay people, and lay women, and lay men, and all of that. And it's kind of interesting because when I was in Korea, I was at this temple, and in this temple there was this monk that was older than Zen Master Sung Sun, and he was a chanting monk. And the thing is, that's all he did. He chanted his whole life, and he would do the ceremonies, and that was all he did. Um, and so in that sense, Zen Master Sung Sung was his younger brother, and Zen Master Sung Sung went all around the world and did all these, started all this kind of practicing and teaching. So it's really is a kind of interesting thing because, like at the end of the story, somebody said that what it is that about Ta Tsung was that Ta Tsung, what he had done, what he had achieved into his in his life, is he had become his actual self. He actually actualized who he really was, without any apologies for any of this or that. But he just actualized himself, just who he was. And so I guess I think that's important because we have a lot of ideas about practicing and what to do with this practice and yada yada and all of that. But it's really important that we as individuals we find our true self, and finding that true self is then what do we do? How do we express that true self? Okay, and so your way of expression and my way of expression is just almost always going to be different. I don't think there's two people that will ever be the same. Always in the direction of how can I help, and really with the understanding, like I said, if you look inside and understand that there's no I, my, or me, does it make a whole lot of sense to then see how much friends you can get on Facebook, how much money you can make, and what you can do for I? If this I is actually just a figment of your imagination, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So when you see that, and then you see the other side of that being that we're all connected, then how is it that you act? So that your actions, you can help the water, you can help the ocean, the forest, other people. You can help the world. In fact, in that sense. And so that's a kind of like a story that I thought I would say. And it looks like 12:30. Is that what we were supposed to do until 12:30?
That's right.
Okay. Is
I'm
that
going,
is that is that good timing or what?